I've spent the last 20 years building retirement plans for hundreds of them. Couples who've saved $5 million, couples who've saved $500,000. Business owners, teachers, nurses, physicians, people who've done absolutely everything right, and people who were scared they'd done everything wrong. And when you do this long enough, something strange starts to happen. The same patterns start to show up over and over and over again. The same fears, the same mistakes. And here's the part that surprised me the most. A lot of the things that I believed when I started this career, the things I was taught that seemed completely reasonable, turned out to be completely wrong once I saw people live through 20, 30 years of retirement. So today I want to walk you through the lessons that I've learned. Not the textbook stuff, the real stuff. The things that actually decide whether someone spends their retirement relaxed and confident or stressed and second-guessing every single dollar. Some of these are going to go against what you've heard everywhere else, and one of them completely changed the way that I look at money in retirement. We'll get to that one later. Let's start with the lesson that shocked me the most because it flips the whole thing on its head. And real quick, if you want help building this out for yourself, there's a link in the description. Feel free to click it, book a call with my team. We at Three Oaks Wealth look at this stuff every single day. We're happy to go over where you stand today and where your gaps might be. Let's jump into the first lesson. Our first lesson is that the balance of your portfolio honestly barely predicts who thrives throughout retirement. When I first started out, I genuinely believed that the people with the most money would be the happiest and the most secure in retirement. It just made sense. You have more money, you have less to worry about. That's the whole point, right? Well, 20 years later, I can tell you that's just not how it works, and it's not even close. I've sat across the table from a couple worth almost $4 million who were terrified to spend a nickel. They wouldn't take that trip, they wouldn't help their grandkids, they were just living like they were broke because deep down they were terrified that it could all disappear. I've also sat across the table from a retired school teacher that had saved a little more than $600,000. But she was calm, she was happy, she was completely at peace with her plan. It wasn't about their profession, it wasn't about their personality. The difference had nothing to do with how much money they'd saved. The difference was whether they had a system that told them exactly what their money was supposed to do for them. Here's why this matters so much for you. If you're sitting there thinking that the only thing standing between you and a successful retirement is a bigger number, you're chasing the wrong thing. I've watched people work 5 more years just to pad an account, but they didn't wind up any more secure. They just wound up older with the same anxiety because nobody ever gave them a structure that they could trust. The person who thrives isn't the one with the most money, it's the one who knows precisely where their income is going to come from, in what order, and what happens when the market has a bad year. That's it. That's the whole game. So before you obsess over the balance, ask yourself a better question. Do I know exactly what this money needs to produce for me every single month and where that income is going to come from? Because that answer matters a lot more than the number itself. And once you understand that, it opens up the next thing I had to unlearn, which is one of the most surprising mistakes I see people make with their money. The second lesson is most people take too little out of their retirement nest egg, not too much. Early in my career, I thought my main job was protecting retirees from spending too much after they stopped working. I figured that most people would travel through retirement, blow through their savings, and then run out of money and become destitute. And sure, that sometimes happens, but it's actually the rare case. The far more common problem, and more common by a country mile, is that retirees often spend too little. They get into retirement, they give up their income, and then they just kind of freeze. They're so scared of running out of money that they underlive throughout their entire retirement. They don't take the trips, they don't replace that old car, they spend their healthiest, most active years sitting at home because they're kind of stuck. I once worked with a man named Doug. He was a retired airplane mechanic up in Oregon, and he retired with about $3 million saved, his house paid off, a pension benefit, and Social Security benefits. By every single measure, he could spend more than he was. But for 40 years, he'd trained himself to save, put his head down, go to work, get more money in the accounts, and he simply wasn't able to flip that switch. He was eating into basically none of his long-term savings, and he felt guilty every single time that he spent money on himself. When we actually mapped it out for him and showed him that he could spend almost double what he was, even throughout bad markets, it was shocking. He was basically in disbelief. He'd been robbing himself of all these possibilities basically out of fear. And here's what nobody warns you about. Your health and your money do not run on the same clock. Those years where you can travel, hike, play with your grandkids, those years are front-loaded in retirement. If you spend your 60s and 70s too scared to enjoy what you've built throughout your working years, that window closes. You don't get those years back later. The money's still there, but the energy just isn't. So the goal isn't just to avoid running out of money, it's also to spend confidently, right up until the edge of what your plan can support, and have a system that tells you when you can spend more and when you might need to pull back a little bit. When you have that, the guilt just disappears and you're free to live the retirement that you worked 30 or more years to earn. But even the people who get their spending right are still often blindsided by one specific moment, and it comes a lot faster than they expect. Lesson number 3 is that the first year of retirement is easily the scariest, and nobody prepares you for it. I used to think that the hardest part about retirement planning was the math leading up to it. Save the money, invest it well, pick a date, all that kind of stuff. And I assumed that once someone actually retired, they would feel a sense of relief because the job was done. But what I didn't quite understand back then is that first year in retirement is actually really brutal for most people. Because for your entire working life, you went to work and the money just came in every 2 weeks like clockwork. Cash comes in and it's plenty to cover all your bills each month. That's 30 or 40 years or more of the exact same cadence, the exact same rhythm. And then when you retire, those paychecks stop overnight. Now, instead of the money coming in, you have to start taking money out of the accounts that you've spent your whole life protecting and building up for some future date. And it feels wrong for most people. It kind of feels backwards. I've had a lot of really confident, successful people sit in my office completely rattled the first time that they have to sell investments to raise cash to take money out of these accounts to pay their grocery bills. I remember a woman named Patricia. She was a retired hospital administrator in California. She had a beautifully funded plan. On paper, she looked totally great. But those first few months of actually withdrawing money out of the accounts, she barely slept. She kept calling, asking if she was doing something wrong. She wasn't. She was just feeling that mental whiplash that nobody had really prepared her for. This matters because the transition into retirement is emotional too. It's not just financial. And if you don't expect it, that emotion can push you into bad decisions. Some people panic and they go way too conservative at the exact moment that they need to be staying the course. Or they refuse to spend because pulling money out feels just incredibly uncomfortable. So much so to the point where they slide back into that underliving issue we were just talking about. The fix is to build the structure before you retire, not afterward. You want to know in advance which accounts you're going to pull out of first, exactly how much you want in safe, liquid investments so that you never have to sell stocks at an inconvenient time, and roughly what your income is going to look like month by month. Because when you see it laid out ahead of time, that first year stops feeling like a free fall and starts feeling more like a plan you're simply following. You get that structure right, and it helps protect you from something even bigger down the road that most people don't see coming until it's too late to fix. Real quick, if any of this is hitting close to home, I run a financial planning firm where my team and I help people build these retirement income plans every single day. If you'd like us to look at your situation, there's a link in the description. Feel free to book a call with us. We're happy to share our thoughts. Now let's keep going because this next lesson is the one that usually costs people by far the most money. Our next lesson is that your tax bill in your 80s is actually set up in your 60s. For a long time, I thought about taxes the way most people do. You kind of record your transaction, and then at the end of the year, you file your return and you just do what you can to find deductions and pay a little bit less. That's it. Then I watched what happened to people in their late 70s and early and mid 80s, and it changed the whole way that I thought about this. Here's what I kept running into. Someone spends their entire career, 30, 40 years, stuffing money into their 401k plan at work. It's a great habit. You're saving money for your future. The government lets you use this 401k plan because they want you to save for retirement, and they give you this great tax deferral feature as a result. It's a good thing in general, but there's a catch that you don't feel until decades later. You never paid tax on all that money. The IRS allows you to use these accounts because they want you to save for retirement, but they're still waiting around to tax you on the money that you stuffed into that 401k plan, and they force you to start taking it out when you're in your mid-70s. Under the current rules, you have to start taking money out of the accounts, and those distributions are considered taxable income when you're 75. A few years ago, I worked with a couple. Both of them were engineers. They'd done a great job saving for their retirement, but the entirety of their retirement portfolio was inside of these tax-deferred 401k plans. Right after they retired when they were in their 60s, life was easy. When they needed money out of their accounts, they took it out of their accounts. They weren't forced to do anything. But by their late 70s, those forced withdrawals got bigger and bigger and bigger. And they got to the point where it shoved this couple into the higher tax brackets, and it wound up costing them tens of thousands of dollars because they were forced to take money out of the accounts that they didn't even need. Money that they didn't want to withdraw, they had to because of the features of these mandatory distribution rules. The reason this matters is that the decisions that create that problem, or prevent it for that matter, are decisions made decades earlier. Where you save your money, what type of account you're using, whether you're using all one type of account or a diverse mix of accounts, whether you do any proactive planning, how much you're putting in, how much you're taking out in the early years. In your 60s, you have the latitude to set yourself up for the future. And those decisions you make during that time period are precisely what can lead you toward this tax bomb that this engineer couple experienced directly. By the time that bomb goes off, most of your options are already gone. So the lesson here isn't just do a Roth conversion or any single trick. So the lesson here isn't do a Roth conversion or do any one specific single trick or strategy. The lesson is that taxes in retirement are a 30-year problem, not a 1-year problem. Because the people that wind up paying the least amount of taxes over the course of their retirement are the ones that map out the whole picture early and are thoughtful surrounding what accounts they're using, what kind of tax strategies they're using, and they figure out this problem of what the picture will be like in their 80s all the way back in their 60s. The people who tend to pay the least amount of taxes across their retirement are the ones who just map all of this out early. They use a variety of different accounts and tax strategies, and they're the ones who really take control of their income and their tax planning in their 60s, so they're not bitten by this tax bomb all the way in their 80s. Now, even a perfect tax plan is not going to help you if you break the one rule that decides more outcomes than anything else. And that leads us to our next lesson, which is that the plan you can stick to beats the perfect plan every single time, no matter what. When I was younger and a little bit greener, I thought that my job was to build the mathematically perfect plan for people, the one that just optimized every single nuance across the board. The ideal mix of investments, the perfect distribution rate, all the right tax planning in all the right places, a totally perfect system. I was pretty good at it. I'd spend hours getting everything precisely right. And then I started seeing people abandon these totally optimized, perfect plans at exactly the wrong moment. Here's the pattern for how that happens. It starts with the market dropping. We know the market drops, but every time it does is for a slightly different reason, and it always feels scarier in the moment. And the person who has the technically perfect plan with the aggressive growth mix of investments always tends to panic sell toward the bottom and lock in those losses forever. Meanwhile, the person with the slightly less optimized plan, but the one that they understood and believed in and could follow, they're the ones who tend to stick it out through the tougher times. They ride it out, they recover, and 10 years later, they're in a far better position because even though their plan wasn't technically optimized around the board, that was the plan they were able to stick with. And over and over and over again, that consistency is what matters. I had a client a while back, his name was Frank. He was a retired small business owner, and he insisted on a calmer, more conservative plan than the numbers would suggest he could set up for himself, simply because he knew himself. On paper, we could easily have built a plan for him with a higher expected return, but Frank knew himself very well. He knew he'd bail if things got ugly, so we built a plan that he could stick with through a storm. Then when the next big market drop happened, he didn't even flinch because he was in a plan that never scared him in the first place. That's the plan that worked. This point matters more than almost anything else in this video. The best investment strategy in the world doesn't mean anything if you can't stick with it when things look a little bit scary. And things absolutely will get scary from time to time. Over a 30, 35, 40-year retirement, we should expect a good number of substantial market drops. That's not a maybe. This is just a feature of the stock market and capitalistic system that most of us have our retirement savings invested in. So don't build the plan that looks best on the spreadsheet. Build the plan based on how you actually are and how you actually behave when you're afraid. If a little less growth means that you sleep well at night and you're able to stay consistent during a scary market period, that's well worth it, 100 times over. The plan you stick with will always beat the perfect plan that you abandon. Now, the next lesson is probably one that you've heard before, but almost everybody gets the real cost of it wrong. Lesson number 6 is that one more year working actually costs you a lot more than people think. I used to nod along a lot when people would say that they wanted to work one more year just to be safe, just to give one more year to pad the accounts, one less year of retirement. It sounded reasonable. I just never felt the need to object to it. But after watching this play out dozens and dozens and dozens of times, I started to see a pattern of hidden costs that nobody was really aware of. First off, one more year doesn't ever really become just one more year. It becomes 2 and then 3 and then 4 and sometimes 5. There's always a reason to keep going. I have a bonus coming up in the spring, or the number isn't round enough, or it's just not the right time for the organization. They've done right by me. I want to make sure that I do right by them. And what felt like one more year initially just stretches on and on and on. When the whole time the person already had enough to retire, they just couldn't quite feel it yet. I worked with a gentleman named Raymond once. He was a retired IT director, and he kept pushing his timeline back over and over and over. And every single time we got together, he'd come up with a new excuse not to quit his job, not to step into retirement when really he was stressed and at his core he wanted to. The truth about it is that his plan worked years before he actually stepped into retirement. He just had so much anxiety surrounding how the money would come out of his accounts, he just couldn't get there quite yet emotionally or mentally. The result was that he gave up some of his best, healthiest years chasing a bigger number that never actually wound up providing the certainty that he expected. Here's the part that really stings. The thing you're trading away when you work those extra years isn't small. It's your time, and specifically your good time. It's your energy. It's your window of opportunity to do those things that you've been saving for decades and decades. And unlike money, you can't ever get that time back for any price. Now, I'm not saying just to rush out the door and quit tomorrow. Some people legitimately do need to work those extra few years to make their plans work. And other people, they love their job. That's where they get their social interaction from. They're really engaged by it, and they simply don't want to transition into retirement. That's totally okay too. But do that because it's the right fit, or because you've run the numbers and you're comfortable with what they mean, not just because you're afraid to make that jump into your retirement years. So if you find yourself saying, well, I'll just work one more year, well, stop and actually test it. Run the numbers and weigh the benefits from the drawbacks of actually doing this, because a lot of people will default and assume that working one more year makes their retirement more secure, and that's just not always the case. And that brings me to the last lesson today, which honestly is the one that took me the longest to understand. And that's that retirement is a permission problem, not a math problem. The last thing I had to unlearn is perhaps the strangest one, because it really has nothing to do with numbers at all. When I started out, I just naturally assumed that when someone had a sufficient amount of money to last them the rest of their lives, that they would just naturally feel comfortable spending it. I assumed that that confidence to spend would just show up the moment the math worked out. And realistically, it almost never does. People never feel comfortable spending down their money because it's a completely different skill set. This is the thing that took me the longest to understand. The people that really struggle in retirement, they're not waiting on a bigger number, they're waiting on permission. Permission to eat into their savings that they've worked so hard to accumulate over years and years and years. It's permission to stop saving, permission to spend. It's permission to believe that what they've built is actually real and is actually going to work for them for the rest of their life. And here's the part that fascinates me. That permission has to be built into the plan itself, because if it's not, it really never is going to come on its own. I can remember learning this specifically from a client. Her name was Eleanor, retired professor here in California. Eleanor had more than enough saved, but to that point, she had measured how well she was doing financially based on how much she was able to put away every year. And when she made that retirement transitions and the saving stopped, she was lost. There's no way for her to measure her success based on that benchmark she'd been using. So in retirement, the only way she was able to really keep score was by watching the balance climb and climb and climb. And she felt that if she were spending into that balance at all, she'd be losing the game, whatever arbitrary game it was that she'd made up in her head. And what actually worked in Eleanor's case and freed her to be a little bit more comfortable wasn't, adding a bigger balance or adding to the score the way she was keeping score. It was giving her a new system, a new game to play instead that replaced her previous framework entirely. We built her plan around an annual amount she was allowed to spend, totally guilt-free, and some parameters for the circumstances in which she'd need to pull back a little bit on that spending and when she could spend even more. The moment she had that structure in place, she just stopped watching the balance. She started living her life in a more free way. The money hadn't changed at all, but her permission to spend had because of that different structure. This matters because it explains why so many people who did everything right along the way still feel really anxious in retirement. They built the savings, but nobody ever built a structure to help them know they were okay. Without that, the fear just doesn't really ever turn off, no matter how much you have or how big the numbers are. And with this kind of structure, even people with modest savings, they feel genuinely secure because they know that they have a plan that's going to hold across different market cycles. So don't build a plan that just tells you what you have. Build a plan that shows you in plain terms what you can do with it year by year. Give yourself a scoreboard for a good retirement, not just a good career. That's the piece that turns a pile of money, a pile of savings into an actual life in retirement. So those are the biggest things that 20 years in the industry have taught me. And honestly, almost none of it has to do with the size of your account. But here's the thing, most of the time when people sit down to pencil all this out and start making their own plan, they almost always focus on the part of their portfolio that matters the least, instead of the part that allows their plan to last and remain stable for 20 or 30 years. It's the most common mistake I see. It's the one that's working against most people out there without them even knowing it. That's exactly what I break down in this next video right here. I focus on the part of the portfolio that most retirees get wrong and the steps that you can take and what you can focus on instead. That's the next one to watch. I'll see you there.